Once I had enough experience and had gained the trust of my uncle and my dad, I was allowed to take care of the gas island. Eventually, I was able to run 4 pumps at once and also clean the windshields, check oil level if allowed. Sometimes I overpumped the gas. Usually people would understand and pay the extra amount, but if it was only a few cents, I wouldn't bother mentioning it. At that time, my father only made about 2 cents a gallon, so such overcharges cost him profit. He would even get upset with me if I had given out too many green stamps. I was inclined to be a little too generous. All in all, though, it was much more of an asset to him, allowing them to work uninterrupted on repairs in the garage. My Uncle Pat tended to be more generous with my pay than my father. Occasionally, he put an extra dollar in. Saturday night after work, my father and uncle would stop at the bar room at the junction of Millbury Street and Ballard Streets. First, he'd leave me in the car to wait. I'd sit there patiently listening to the car radio. Johnny Cash's Walk the Line is a song that sticks in my memory. Behind the Green Door is another. These are particularly poignant memories. I didn't mind waiting in the car, sometimes more than an hour. Often my father would be grinning and wide-eyed when he returned to the car. He'd spend the 10-minute ride home talking about how mad my mother was going to be when we got there. This was one of the few times when he would actually be talkative with me. In time, though, technically illegal, I was allowed in with my father and uncle. I'd get a soda, which we call tonic, and potato chips. I even developed a taste for pickled lamb's tongue and hard-boiled eggs. My Uncle Pat used to tell me that it was very important for me to get a good education so I wouldn't have to do grunt work like them. They worked hard, true, but they enjoyed their work and being self-employed. A point of information. I always thought it was unusual that my Uncle Walter, who lived right next to us, very rarely came to my father's station. From what my parents have said, they were instrumental in helping my uncle get the house on Rose Lane. I know they lent them some money to help with the down payment. A very unusual couple, my Uncle Walter and Aunt Mary Sweat, parents of Wally. Well, I always got along with my uncle, who got along with almost everybody. Until late in life, my Aunt Mary was very distant and never all that friendly. I was rarely even allowed into the house. One of my duties was burning the rubbish in back of the station. I would take cardboard cartons and the oil cans, which were cardboard cylinders with aluminum top and bottoms, and build structures, imaginary fortresses and castles, before I would set them on fire. It was a game. I'd construct these elaborate structures and then burn them down. I was really a little firebug. It got so bad that I would fill up small plastic squirt containers like empty glue bottles with gasoline and then squirt the fire. One time, the fire leapt up the spray and almost reached my hand before I let it drop. During the winter, my father and uncle made extra money by plowing snow from the parking lots and driveways. They had a rugged little Jeep with a canvas roof. The windshield wipers were tension operated. You had to turn and wind them. My father took me out on many occasions. It was fun pushing the snow around and making huge piles. It did get very cold in the cabin of the Jeep. That little Jeep was able to clear some rather large parking lots. Speaks a lot of my father's skill. During Christmas time, my dad would pass out some rather expensive gifts to the customers. He'd buy whole cases of whiskey and distribute to his best customers. There were other smaller gifts for other people. It was a happy time and a joyous time. One year, a couple of young adults got drunk in a station. I remember one of them walking into the wall as he tried to get to the bathroom. While this was funny at the time, to me, my father was upset and had to take the guys home and explain their condition to their parents. In hindsight, it was a tragedy that friction developed between the brothers, my dad and uncle. More to the point, between the wives. And they sold the business in 64 or 65 after about 13 years there. They had done very well. My father told me he tried to buy my uncle out, but he couldn't. I have to wonder about that. If he really wanted to, he could have, I think. Neither of them ever found anything quite as satisfying or as lucrative. If I recall correctly, they each ended up with about $3,000 selling the business. They didn't own the building. Though my dad had wanted to purchase and was promised the land and the building, it never happened. About 1960, my parents bought a wooded parcel of land on the shore of the Charlton Reservoir in Oxford, about 14 miles from our home in South Worcester. I think the land cost about $3,000. From the road, the land sloped down at about a 20-degree angle to the shore. It was a pie-shaped section with water frontage of about 50 feet. It was a very picturesque area. Our lot was on a narrower, shallower part of the lake. There was a creek, a stream, about 200 feet from our lot. Off to the left, as you faced the water, motorboats rarely ventured far beyond the water in front of our lot. It got very shallow. It was about 400 feet to the opposite shore. For several years, this area remained undeveloped. At some point, the Y moved in, but even the activity then remained minimal. All in all, it was a pretty quiet area. There was a group of rocks that rose above the water line where turtles could often be seen sunning themselves. And in the Y camp, I found out Janet said that she attended that Y camp at least once. I wonder if we were on the our side when she was over there. That would have been something. The whole family derived a great deal of pleasure from the camp. I put many hours clearing brush, landscaping, building, caring for the boat, waxing it, cleaning it. My dad bought the boat in about '62 for about $1,500. It was a 15-foot fiberglass double hull with a 40 horsepower Johnson motor, which is not really that big, but big enough to pull one skier with not too much problem. 2 skiers was, I think, too much for it. Everyone in the family learned how to water ski eventually. I got up on my first try. Barbara didn't get up until around her 20th attempt, but she got up. Even my mother managed the feat, although her style was rather comical. She was bent over like a greater than sign as she fought to pull on the rope instead of leaning back and letting the boat pull her. I only recall her going once. I got good enough to slalom, though I never attempted to ski jump at the other end of the lake. Within a couple of years, there was a cement cellar with a flat roof that projected out about 10 feet. We also built a wharf that extended about 15 feet from the shore. My dad even had sand trucked in to cover the muck and the mud. He also built a stone wall right along the shore. The building didn't get beyond the cellar stage for years. There was no plumbing, and we had to fill buckets with lake water after using the toilet. Eventually, a shell went up. We did most of the work ourselves. I recall the work I did putting roof shingles on quite vividly. The shell was up for only a few years when my parents finally sold the place for around $30,000. Though I'd asked them to sell me the boat if they ever sold the land, they gave the boat away to other people, those who had bought the land, which kind of upset me because I really, for several reasons, nostalgic reasons, and just to have a boat that I could take, from one place to another, especially with the kids and everything, would have been really great. In '64, I took a trip with the church group to New York's World's Fair. My first trip to the big city, and it was eye-opening. The bigness of everything left quite an impression. At times, it was like I was walking around in a daze, almost unreal. Sometime during my adolescent age, 14 or 15, I experienced one of the most traumatic events of my life. Certainly, I knew better, and it was really out of character. I was with my cousin Wally and 1 or 2 others who must have been Wally's friends because I don't remember them at all. We were in a small field at the beginning of Hawthorne Street, which ran parallel with Rose Lane. It was located in Millbury. Always a firebug, I lit a couple of small fires in the grass just to see what would happen. The fires flared up quickly into the dry grass. I actually held back the others from stamping out the flames right away. When I did decide to put them out, things got out of hand. We started stopping the flames and managed to put out most of it, except one vigorously burning area which stubbornly refused to yield. At that point, I took my jacket off and began frantically beating the flames as they advanced up the field. Wally and the others took off, leaving me to fight the fire alone. I was really fearful that the fire would reach some trees not far off, and maybe the house that was beyond that. Suddenly, several guys came strolling down Hawthorne Street. I yelled for help and they came running. We managed to put the fire out. Flushed, hot, and smoke soiled, I ran home. I flew through the kitchen door. My mother asked me what was wrong. I only responded that I would tell her later, but I had to go to my room first. Another dumb stunt was the induced fainting episode. Three of us, Ray, Biss, Barry Brown, and I, were walking around the back of the school building at Providence Street Junior High at lunchtime. Somehow the technique of how to make someone faint came up. We decided to try. Ray volunteered first. Barry held Ray. He took 10 deep breaths, exhaled deeply, and Barry squeezed him from the back around the chest. I remember Ray fell onto his knees. He didn't seem to pass out, but he said he did. I went next. Ray held me. I took 10 deep breaths. Ray squeezed. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground looking up at everyone and wondering what the heck was going on. Never having gone unconscious before, I thought for an instant that I had just wakened from sleep. It seemed that Ray had let go of me and I collapsed on the ground, my head bouncing off the cement sidewalk. Ray said he had asked me if I was okay and I just said yes, but I don't remember saying anything. I was sent home, but other than being told how stupid a stunt it was, I wasn't even punished. I was just doing what kids do. I remember the first time I was allowed to take the bus downtown, then a pretty active place. City Hall and the Common behind was surrounded by many businesses, Front Street, Franklin Street, Main Street. This was during the 50s and 60s, before the advent of suburban malls killed so many downtown shopping areas. The city was the center of retail and business activity in central Massachusetts. During Christmas, Main Street was elaborately decorated, and all the stores would make their own individual contributions. The area immediately in front of City Hall was the hub of the city's bus routes. I would take number 4 Millbury City line to Worcester Center and go to one of the movie theaters in the immediate area. Most of the movies I went to see were science fiction. This was the era when the genre was very popular. There were a few of the movies that have come to be regarded as classics. I can't remember too many. Titles like The 50-Foot Man, The Angry Red Planet. The special effects were primitive by today's standards, but were enough to keep us mesmerized. Westerns were big then too, but I can't remember a single one of those. Actually, Christmas Eve was spent at my grandparent DiBara's home at Lincoln Street, near the intersection of Lincoln and Plantation. Seems amazing that the whole DiBara family was able to fit into 2 rooms, kitchen and a small living room. We kids ate at a children's table close to the front door. There was all sorts of food, like lots of pasta, meatballs, sausages, fried fish, stuffed squid, which we knew as dirigibles. Until '62, the meal was presided over by my grandfather, Matteo. The front door opened into a small entryway, the mudroom, where outerwear could be stored. Usually we left our coats, hats, gloves, and boots in the master bedroom, just outside the entryway. The room was always dark with religious pictures and icons hung on the walls and on the bureaus. The atmosphere in the house was thick with smells and loud conversations. The kitchen table was so close to the wall that at least 2 or 3 people had to move if someone against the wall had to go to the bathroom. Occasionally, since the small living room was off the kitchen, it was necessary to crawl under the table to get to the bathroom. I always look forward to this time. We eat lots of good things and we got to stay up late. There was always a candy dish, especially nonpareils, in the living room. One time I was lying on the floor, sucking on a dime, when it lodged in my throat. It's happened previously, as I mentioned, at our home on Rose Lane, and my Aunt Doris was able to get it out. This time my grandfather hung me over the toilet by the feet and whacked me on the back until the coin popped out. As much as I enjoyed Christmas Eve, Christmas Day was pure ecstasy. We got up early, usually around 5 in the morning, and headed for the tree. As early as we got up, my mother never lost her temper on this special day. There was nothing like the feeling of opening Christmas gifts on Christmas morning. It's like the whole world was created to make you happy. Later in the morning, we would get together with my Aunt Doris and the cousins. Some years we celebrated at our house, but mostly at my aunt's. I liked it best when we went to my aunt's because there were more gifts to unwrap there, and it seemed like the food was just better. It was, because my mother was a atrocious cook. The turkey, the stuffing, and everything else made heaven on earth even better. Remembering times like this is to understand what people mean when they say we should enjoy each moment. For a child is no past or future to think about, only the present to enjoy. 1957 was a remarkable year. It was November that the Russians orbited the first artificial Earth satellite, Sputnik. This came at a time when I was really already interested in science fiction and our new space program. The space race between America and the Soviet Union began in earnest. I grew up with NASA in our space program. I memorized every rocket, as I mentioned. For a brief period, I bought and launched small solid fuel rockets, hobby rockets. I launched them from the field across the street. They would shoot up from the platform, soar into the sky, then deploy a small parachute and float lazily to the ground. So lazily, in fact, that I lost at least one when it floated over the highway, the cutoff. Junior high school was a great time for me. I did really well academically, getting all A's in the 8th grade and almost repeated that in the ninth, but I got a B in phys ed. I actually got to know quite a few kids there. It was one of the most extroverted periods of my life. My first public speaking event occurred in junior high assembly when I recited some Bible verses from the Christmas story during a holiday assembly. I was elected homeroom president in one of the 3 years. A poem of mine made it into the 9th grade graduation program. While I was there, I took a number of standardized exams that were designed to discover your aptitudes. If I remember correctly, they also predicted IQ. Mine was 115. Later in life, I took 2 separate online exams that scored an IQ number of 130. These were not extensive tests, and there's a whole argument about what IQ is all about anyway. Those junior high tests showed I scored best in spatial relations in the 93rd percentile. I made new friends at Prov, Barry Brown, Raymond Biss, and Wayne Friedgen. During these years at Prov, several important rocket launches occurred, the most significant of which were Alan Shepard's suborbital flight and John Glenn's orbital mission. The whole of junior high was called to assembly to watch a single TV up on the stage. There were many who just saw this as an opportunity to chit-chat, but lots of us felt the thrill of pride to watch the exciting events as they happened. One of the dumber experiences of my life occurred at Prov. The teachers would occasionally let us know our grades before the report cards were handed out. In math class, I thought I heard the math teacher say I was going to get a D. I know that didn't sound right, but I told my mother. That night she told my father to punish me for not doing my work. He didn't punish me very often, but this night I got it with the belt. The next day I got the report card itself. I had received a B, not a D. When I showed it to my mother, she didn't apologize, just told me that the punishment was my own fault for not listening more closely. Also, I should have been able to determine what my grade would be. It was one of my funny childhood stories today. In the 8th or 9th grade, I partnered with a friend, Barry Brown, to build a science project. Our project consisted of a world map with an orbital path of John Glenn placed over the map. It also included a mock-up of the Mercury capsule with a seat and a drawing of the instrument panel. We won honorable mention in the citywide science fair. I must have been about 10 or 11 when I decided to become an altar boy at our church, St. Catherine of Sweden. I remember quite vividly, actually St. Catherine of Sweden was just behind the gas station, set off a little bit to the left as you look from the gas station. The pastoral room was located at the entrance of the building on the right. I had to memorize the appropriate Latin responses. I remember studying the card that contained cue phrases and the responses which were printed in red. We were allowed to use cards during the service, but it didn't take long to learn the appropriate physical and vocal responses. remained an altar boy for several years. I served at weddings and funerals. Weddings were especially desired assignments because we got tips from the best man. I served during the time just before Pope John the 23rd's reforms. The Mass was in Latin, and the priest did most of the service with his back facing the parishioners. One pastor for the whole time I attended St. Catherine's of Sweden was Father Riley. Smiles didn't come easily to him, but he took his pastoral responsibilities seriously and always seemed to me to be very devout. I think he would have made a better monk. He didn't relate all that well with his flock and was definitely a conservative in a religious sense. He had an identical twin brother who was a Monsignor, a step above the parish priest. About the time I became a teenager, a new church building was constructed, a modern, sleek building with lots of stained glass windows. My father and uncle donated a stained glass window. A nameplate was placed below that window, which was located on the right-hand side of the church at ground level. At this stage of my life, I strove to be a good Catholic. I studied my catechism with a seriousness exceeding most of the other kids. I served as an altar boy for several years. I think I even had faith at one time, perhaps because I was a serious student and wanted to know all I could that made the world go round. I became a little confused at first and eventually cynical about the church's teaching. I recall one catechism class where heaven was explained as a place of comforting light. Everyone in heaven was filled with happiness. I'm not sure if the question actually came up or whether it was part of the lesson, but the matter of degree came up. If everyone was happy then, what difference did it make if someone just made it as compared to someone who lived the life of a saint? The response was that each person's soul was like a chalice or a cup. The better the person, the larger the chalice. Even though the person with the small chalice was happy as they could be, the person with the larger chalice was happier in a relative sense. On some level, I suppose this makes sense, but it disturbed me on two levels. First, the idea of heaven as an eternity of inactivity, even in the presence of God, wasn't all that appealing. Secondly, if one felt as happy as possible anyway, then what difference did it make as to the size of one's cup? During the 9th grade, we took a field trip to South High School. Several seniors spoke to the group. They seemed so smart and very adult. I sensed the high school would be a transforming experience, that I was sure to leave a different person. Even more ancient than Prov, South High had witnessed legions of students pass through its halls. The physical facilities were so old that the floorboards in the halls of the 3rd floor rippled and buckled like static waves on an ocean. Walking without tripping required at least a degree of attention and balance. It would have served me better to have attended a smaller school where integration into the larger social setting might have been more likely. At South, I was totally lost in the crowd. Adolescent angst, together with the sheer size of the student body, stifled and intimidated me. My circle of friends did not expand beyond the ones I had at Prov. My 1965 graduating class from high school was 500 students or more. Part of my isolation had to do with my desire for spending money to keep my car on the road and for other gadgets and activities. I didn't actively seek to become involved with larger groups. I shunned clubs and team activities. I was content with a small group of friends who were as intimidated by high school scene as I was. I think feelings of inadequacy contributed to directing my energies to work, money, and spending. In November of '63, President Kennedy was assassinated. I just arrived home from school and was sitting at the kitchen table talking with my mother when there was a news flash over the radio saying the president had been shot. We turned the TV on immediately. At that point, I felt certain macabre excitement. What if he was killed? What would happen? It didn't take long before the news came that the president had indeed been killed. Everything came close to stopping as the country went into shock, then mourning. The news was on around the clock and everyone was glued to the TV set or the radio. One of the men suspected shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, was captured, then shot to death on live television. I was at the church that Sunday with my family. I didn't see the incident until we got back home. Suddenly the Camelot years were over, and my own political innocence severely undermined. The unbridled optimism in the future had received a serious blow. That single unknown madman could actually have committed such a crime shook my trust in the adult world and in a government that was supposed to be so all-knowing and all-powerful. I spent Saturdays and summers working at my dad's station. During my teen years, I played many board games with Wayne. Risk, Civil War, and we even kept a tally of all the games we played. We were just about even. A weekend might include movies with George and Ray, with me providing the transportation. I owned a car almost from the time I got my license at 16. At about the same time, I started a new part-time job at a discount department store, the Fair, just across the cutoff. After having worked up at the gas station for so long, I wanted to come in from the cold and rain and get a job out of the elements. The job in the shoe department involved keeping the racks stocked and the area clean. The Fair was a setting for another nasty accident. I was moving stock from the second to the third floor on a conveyor belt. For some reason, I needed to get up to the third floor. Instead of going a long way up the stairs, I climbed onto the moving belt and started walking up. I ducked to avoid the steel beam between the floors, but not low enough. My head hit the edge of the beam, and I staggered from the impact. If I had fallen off the conveyor, it would have been about a 10-foot drop to a concrete floor. I was stunned, but thankfully didn't lose consciousness and managed to climb off. I walked through the store, my hand on my head, trying to stem the flow of blood that was pouring down on my face. It took me about 2 or 3 minutes to get to my department and find the department manager, getting shocked looks from some customers as I walked about. The department manager was a small, nervous, skinny little guy. When he saw me, he turned even whiter than usual. He grabbed my arm and guided me to the front of the store. There, one of the store managers asked for a cloth to put on my head to stem the bleeding. Someone handed him a dust cloth, which he threw promptly into the air and yelled for a clean one. A police car arrived in a few minutes and took me to the hospital emergency room. A nurse looked the cut over, remarking that it was a nasty gash. Before they could stitch it, though, they needed to reach my parents to get approval. They were at the camp in Charlton without a phone. The Worcester police had to contact Oxford police, who drove down to the water to let my parents know. While all this was going on, I was waiting in the ER with the blood drying in my hair. After more than an hour, the doctor finally decided to stitch my head up, even without approval. My parents finally arrived and gave the go-ahead. Curiously enough, it happened on the very day that I had other stitches removed from just over my left eye. I had a cyst removed from that area about a week earlier. After removing the stitches, Dr. Joseph told me that I was fine, just be careful about my head. Electronics, along with the space program and sci-fi, was an area of special interest. I had a set of some dozen books, military issue, on electronics, and I read at least twice. I tinkered with old radios, rewired speakers in my car. I bought a couple of Radio Shack electronics kits with projects. One time I even set up an intercom between upstairs bedroom and the kitchen. The joy and satisfaction of finally completing my senior year at South High was tempered by the difficulty I was having with mathematics. I got my first and only F in the third marking period. I believe my math teacher's name was Mr. Quidadamo. He was a good math teacher, but it was as though I always seemed to grasp concept just after the main tests. I was in the highest math group, but could only manage to get a D for the first 2 marking periods. By the end of the year, though, I managed to pull my overall grade point to get a C. I got A's and B's in the other subjects. I ended up ranking number 47 out of 433 in my graduating class, which was certainly respectable. During the summer of '65, before starting at Worcester State, I worked at Northeast Towel Service. That's where my aunt worked as a supervisor. I must have been nuts to take the job there. It was dirty, disgusting work. My aunt worked there as the supervisor, as I mentioned. My sister Barbara worked there folding laundered towels. Even my cousin Greg worked there as a driver who delivered clean towels and picked up soiled ones. The job involved moving armloads of soiled towels from large carts into enormous washing and drying machines. The towels often contained toxic chemicals and metal shavings. While working there, I got into my second fight of my life. One of my fellow workers pushed me and knocked my glasses off. I jumped out of the cart and was in the air and grabbed him. A few punches were thrown before we wrestled each other to the ground. Within moments, my aunt came running down from the office and slapped the other kid across the face. We ended up going back to work but avoided each other for the duration of the time there. Probably as a result of working there, I developed small growths on my head that had to be operated on and removed by Dr. Croce, a surgeon. I entered Worcester State with high expectations. My first semester there was in the fall of '65. There were only 3 buildings, and 2 of them were almost brand new. The old building housed most of the administrative offices and some classrooms. The new science building, a concrete and glass rectangle, contained efficient rectangular classrooms. All of this expansion exemplified what was happening around the country as the baby boomers headed for the colleges. Originally, Worcester State was called Worcester Normal, though its function remained the same, teacher education. I enjoyed my first year there. It was much like an extension of high school. There was a small school atmosphere about it. It was then a strictly commuting college, no dorms. The rooms in the old building were right out of the 19th century. The wooden floors, plastering walls, ceilings, and slate chalkboards. I remember the chemistry class was held in a room with a stadium-like seating that had a capacity of 50 to 60 people. There was something about the old rooms that impressed me. I think it was the antiquity and the feeling of history of the many students who had sat there to learn their craft. I was in the math science program, so my courses were oriented toward the sciences. I enjoyed my classes, and even though it was a commuting college, I got to know many new students. I felt more comfortable there than at high school. I began working at Charles' Restaurant as a busboy with my friend Ray. I actually enjoyed the job. The first thing I'd do when I arrived was get a free meal, except for lobster, for which they specialized. Quite a perk, though. At the end of the night, the waitresses would split some of their tips with us. Once diners began drifting in, I was pretty much busy from that time on, and that passed quickly. I didn't put enough time in to think about becoming a waiter. In 1966, a new movie theater went up on Lincoln Street, not too far from my grandparents' house. I got a job there as an usher, showing people to their seats. I worked there for the length of 2 movies. Alfie, a depressing movie about a woman forced to endure an illegal abortion, and The Longest Day, about the D-Day invasion. Interestingly, Janet worked as a cashier at a movie theater at Webster Square in Worcester for a time. Something happened to my attitude during my second year at Worcester State, though. I became tired of the classes and school altogether. My grades began to suffer. If the specter of Vietnam wasn't hanging over me, I would have struck out on my own to see other parts of the country, seeking some kind of little adventure. During the late spring of '67, I began to look into military service, since there didn't appear to be any way to avoid the draft outside of staying in school. Now, that's not strictly true. I think had I pushed the lack of vision in my right eye, that could have kept me out. I didn't want to do anything with the Army. I began checking out the Air Force, but there was no slots available. I turned to the Navy. They had something called the cash program that involved, this is not cash money, cash like a group that involved my enlistment. Following a 90-day holding period before I had to report for duty, my 2 years of college would even earn me an E3 instead of an E1 rating. I wasn't guaranteed any specific training program, though. Before I actually enlisted, I had to explain my intention to my parents. They were upset. My mother offered to pick up my car payments and my auto insurance. My father got angry as I've ever seen him. He argued that he had given the country more than his fair share, but I refused to budge. In late '67, I took a trip to Montreal, Canada with George and Denise to enjoy the Expo '67. It was very impressive. Actually, what came to mind was the amazing subway system, which ran on tires and was very smooth and quiet. I headed to boot camp at the Great Lakes Training Station in October. The trip to Chicago's O'Hare Airport was my first plane ride. It was really exciting. We landed at night. I can still remember the lights of the city as we flew over Chicago. The period October through December was so intense and stressful. I was in a 13-week orientation program. The boot camps were designed to instill discipline and test stamina. The physical training was less important than the psychological aspect, though we did lots of marching around the parade grounds. I gained more than 10 pounds. Eating was one of the few pleasures afforded us. There was plenty of food in variety and quantity. I recall the sign in the mess that admonished us to take all you want, but eat all you take. It's amazing how much things have changed. I recall vividly the many shots we were given, especially the bicillin shot that was administered in the lower back. For days afterward, it felt like there was a basketball lodged in my back. One of the more frightening experiences occurred during a test for swimming ability. A group of us were ordered into a large and deep pool. Staying afloat about 5 minutes or so would excuse us from taking any swimming lessons. Since I was an excellent swimmer, I thought this would be a piece of cake. But surrounded by so many guys flailing and trying to keep from drowning, it was no easy task to stay afloat. Stationed around the pool were a bunch of guys with long, hooked poles to pull at-risk and floundering swimmers out, and they were busy. After floating around for what seemed like an eternity, and just when I started to feel myself panicking because I was being splashed with so much water I was having a hard time breathing without gulping it, someone finally told me to get out. I passed. Instilling a sense of discipline was the primary function of the boot camp experience. We had to stand watches around the clock. Fatigue was the toughest part of this duty. Pulling sentry duty meant standing there for hours, having to perform certain movements depending upon the situation. That was not fun. One particular episode stands out in my mind. Some petty officer or chief walked up to a fellow who happened to be holding his rifle improperly. In order to make an impression, this jerk kept knocking the part of the barrel that had the sight at the end against the fellow's forehead, actually bruising and breaking the skin. Poor fellow was too frightened to correct himself. The two supervisors were actually enjoying tormenting him. I don't know what I would have done if the same thing had been pulled on me. That was just plain cruel and abusive. During the first few weeks of training, we were given a battery of aptitude tests called GATs, General Aptitude Tests. Toward the end of basic training, when the results came in, I had done very well in everything except the flat score, foreign language aptitude tests. I really wanted something in electronics that would serve me well for when I got out of the service. Had I taken the test only a few months before, I could have gotten into ET, Electronics Technical School, that would have involved this 9 months of training. I would have had to extend my enlistment to 6 years from the 4 that I was in for. At this point, I wasn't inclined to take that route. Closest thing I could get was CT, Communications Technician, that involves some 6 months of training in Morse code, typing, basic electronics, and radio operation. I made it home for Christmas and New Year's. After that, I headed to Pensacola, Florida, to NCTC, Naval Communications Training Center. On the flight south, I was about as depressed as I'd ever been in my life. I even toyed with the idea of jumping on another flight to someplace else once I got there. My mood improved after I arrived, though. I liked the sun and the warmth of Florida. The base was open and attractive, though my initial quarters lacked any privacy. The rooms housed 4 guys each. This was an improvement over basic training, where everyone had only a bunk and a large dormitory. We were responsible for keeping the rooms pristine condition. The memory that comes to mind about those early months is of my training how to use the industrial floor buffer. For experienced users, it was fun to watch recruits struggle with these movable monsters that could easily spin off on their own. I managed to pick up the art fairly quickly, and before long I could move a machine with one finger. I was there to pick up the skills necessary for my rating, communications technician. I had a couple of skills which made the experience a bit less challenging. I could type, and I had taught myself a good deal about the electronics theory. Still, it took hard work and concentration to pick up the Morse code at the pace they wanted. After a few months, there was further culling of the trainees. While code takers could still be assigned to Vietnam, a more technical subgroup assigning to ships and small land-based security facilities. I was standing at assembly when they made the announcement that I was accepted into that program, the T branch. I was delighted and relieved. This extended my stay there until August.